Scott Lauber covers the Phillies, Philly.com, the Inquirer. He is in San Diego for the Phillies and the Padres. The Phillies make a deal. They had a big left-handed bat, but how's he going to fit in? How much will he play? If anything, though, Peter, he certainly adds some punch off the bench. Justin Bour is in the mix. Scott Lauber joins us now on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline to discuss a little bit more about this deal and this series with the San Diego Padres in San Diego. What's going on, Scotty? How are you?
Hey, guys. How are you?
Everything is good, man. And, Phillies continuing to tinker with this team. An interesting deal they make today for Justin Bour. I'm interested to get your thoughts on how you think he fits in. I mean, this isn't a message for Carlos Santana, I would imagine. This is more, hey, we don't have to go to Andrew Knapp as our key left-handed bat off the bench anymore.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I look at it kind of the way I looked at the move at the deadline for Wilson Ramos. And to a certain extent, a few days earlier than that for Asdrubal Cabrera, as much as those guys could help the lineup on a daily basis, it forced Scott Kingery to the bench. Eventually, Ramos will force Jorge Alfaro to the bench. And with all due respect to, like, Jesmuel Valentin and Dylan Cousins, it assures that those guys don't get anywhere near home plate in meaningful games down the stretch. And, you know, I think it just strengthens your team all around. And to me, that's what this does. Now, look, I don't know yet the name of the minor league pitcher going back to Florida. I think we can all assume it's not Sixto Sanchez and it's not Adonis Medina, and it's probably, you know, not somebody who is going to appear on the top of your prospect list. Now, assuming that's the case, what's not to like about adding a controllable left-handed hitter who can help you off the bench and beyond this year gives you some choices? I mean, all of a sudden you go into the offseason, no matter how the rest of this year goes, with depth at first base that you didn't already have. And so he could turn into an asset that gets you another piece, either by flipping him or flipping someone else. So I don't think it's a message to Carlos Santana. I think it's just a move to make them stronger now and give them more options going forward.
Yeah, I noticed in the splits, Santana has some odd splits. His average is higher as a righty than it is a lefty, but he has more power from the left side than the right side. But it seems, Scott, and you're around the game every day, that a lot of these lefties average, including Bour, because of the shift.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, I know that Santana gets shifted as much as any hitter in the National League when he bats from the left side. It obviously doesn't happen quite as often when he bats from the right side. We've talked about the shift on this show, I think, you and I, and we've said how odd it is, right, that left-handed hitters get shifted so much more than right-handed hitters, and that also goes for switch guys like Santana. So, yeah, I would think the shift probably has a lot to do with those numbers. You know, it's not like, I mean, a lot of switch hitters do have a dominant side, and it might just be, I haven't honestly looked at his career numbers to know whether this is typical or not for Santana, but, you know, maybe the left side is simply his dominant side, and it's as simple as that, or the right side, I should say. But you know, yeah, they've been there, and certainly I guess Bour could maybe help that a little bit. He was an everyday guy with the Marlins. He certainly had a really good year last year. This year, the numbers are kind of down across the board. So, you know, I don't know too much what to make of that just yet, but certainly he does give them more options.
Well, Scott, I'll tell you this. Bour, you know, he's a career 270-something hitter. I mean, he's been 289, 264. I mean, his batting average is considerably lower than any of his four previous seasons, and I would have to imagine that the shift is a big reason in his batting average being down.
You would think. Yeah. You know, the number that jumps out at me, though, for Bour, check out his numbers against the Atlanta Braves, not just this year, but for his career. You know, I actually just typed them for a story that we're throwing up online. You know, for his career, he's got 13 homers in 54 games against Atlanta, an OPS over 1,000. This year, that OPS is 1227. He's a 304 hitter against them this year. You got all those games at the end of the year against the Braves. I am sure that Matt Klentak and company, when they were looking at Bour, took a look at what he does against Atlanta, and I'm sure that that's a bit of a factor here. You are talking about somebody, like I said, who's controllable beyond this year, so there are other considerations. But for this year specifically, seems like there's a definite intention to get a guy who kills the Braves, and that can't hurt, right?
Yeah, I agree with that. And, obviously we talked about it today. Pete and I, Scott, were saying that they're a better team right now with this deal than they were the day before. But obviously every game now gets more and more intensified. And this is a series with the Padres that they're in last place, this Padres team. You've got to win this series after losing that series in Arizona. This is a very important season to kind of set the tone for when they come back home, and they've got some matchups with Washington coming up. So this is in Boston, this week with the Mets in that 5-gamer, and then they got the Nationals for 6. This series here, this is a series that that turns into an important one.
Yeah, no doubt. And look, we've seen, especially on the road, we have seen some series against second division clubs that have gotten away from the Phillies. They had a rough series a few weeks ago in Cincinnati, not a good team. They had a rough series earlier in July, right before the All-Star break, against the Marlins, not a good team. So, there's no shame in going to Arizona and losing 2 of 3, especially when you were in, the Monday night game that went to extra innings and could have easily won that game had you done your job in the 9th with Sir Anthony Dominguez. But there is no excuse for coming to San Diego and losing 2 out of 3. In fact, you really ought to sweep that series. So, I think that it's an important series. I think it's an important series too from the standpoint of they can't continue what they have done, which is to kind of play down to some of these teams for whatever reason. They've got to come here and kind of, if you're going to be one of the better teams in the National League, flex your muscle against a real weakling. And, the Padres are starting a guy tonight who's making his major league debut. I think tomorrow night's pitcher is also making his debut. So they're facing some young guys. They're facing some guys they've never seen before, but they're also facing some guys they probably should beat. So, I agree. I think that there's really probably no excuse for going home with anything less than 2 out of 3, if not a 3-game sweep in this series.
Scott Lauber with us, talking Phillies baseball on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Scott, you referenced that Jake Arrieta quality start that they basically wasted when things fell apart at the end of the game. My question to you is Sir Anthony Dominguez, really relying on the slider instead of the fastball in that appearance. Are you seeing some chinks in the armor, so to speak, or the fact that Sir Anthony, it's a long season, he hasn't played baseball this many times and made this many appearances? You're starting to see some weaknesses in Sir Anthony Dominguez.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, Scott, he did most of his work as a starting pitcher in the minors, right? Or at least half of it.
Almost all of it until this season. And how much time did he spend in the minors this season? Barely a month. So, absolutely. And that was something I thought about a lot on Monday night during that game after Dominguez blew that save is, they've leaned on him a lot this year. Almost all of his appearances have been high leverage appearances, whether he's in the 9th inning or earlier in the game in a tough spot with the part of a lineup coming up or whatnot. And if he's getting tired at this point in the season, it would not be a surprise, and it would not be a shock at all. Now, it was interesting. Brad Lidge was on that trip in Arizona. It was planned in advance. Obviously, he was in town over the weekend for the 2008 festivities, and he lives out in Colorado. So he assists the Phillies now and then, and it was a convenient time for him to hitch a ride back out west and be with the team for a series. And I had a chance to talk to him on Tuesday, the day after Dominguez blew that save, and had kind of that rough outing on Sunday, the day before against the Marlins. And I began talking to Lidge about exactly that, about the workload and kind of how does a young reliever who's really a reliever for the first time, not just at the big league level, but at any level, how does he manage to conserve his arm and be prepared to get through a long season, unlike any he's ever been a part of before. And Lidge talked a little bit about that, shared some secrets that he had in terms of cutting back on the amount of throwing you do between appearances and stuff. But one of the things he talked about a lot was what you just said, Pete, the pitch
selection.
The pitch selection in the Diamondbacks game specifically, where he went to the slider after throwing, I think, 3 or 4 fastballs to begin that inning, and the Diamondbacks couldn't touch them. And Lidge said he had a long conversation with Dominguez, and he said, listen, your fastball is nasty. And when you're throwing it like that and they can't touch it, you don't have to show them anything else, not until they hit your fastball. And if you're going to get beat in a game like that, get beat with your best pitch. Don't get beat by throwing a slider just because you think you have to. If they don't give you a reason to do it, don't do it. And I think these are all lessons that Dominguez is learning along the way, and will make him better in the long run. You'd certainly hope that he's a quick learner, and that the next time he's in that situation, he takes the advice that he got from Brad Lidge.
Yeah, I saw your article with Brad Lidge. A great job on that. We're talking with Scott Lauber here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. You also talk about, and this is what, the anti-Gabe people, and there are still anti-Gabe Kapler people out there, this is what drives them crazy, and you get that front row seat to kind of have the, devil's advocate conversation with him, where he lifts guys for defensive replacements, and then they're not around when the game goes into extra innings. If you can get into that, what that discussion was like with Gabe Kapler and how he kind of dug his feet in and said, I'd do it all over again.
Right, and I don't blame him for it. As a matter of fact, when he made those moves on Monday night, I didn't, there were a few of us who cover the team who were sitting there in the press box, and I don't know that any of us were like, what's he doing? I mean, I think that's a pretty conventional move when you're leading late in a game, especially when your defense is as bad as the Phillies' defense has been. I was looking something up the other day. If you like defensive runs saved as kind of a metric to measure defense, and I tend to think metrics are still unreliable when it comes to measuring defense, but that seems to be a pretty decent one. They're like minus 75 for the season, which is one of the worst teams in baseball, and I think you got to go back to like the 2005 Yankees to find a team that that was that bad defensively that made the playoffs, and that team made the playoffs because they crushed the ball. The Phillies don't exactly score a ton of runs, and when you don't defend well late in the game, you've got to make moves like that. And if the downside is that your closer blows a save, you end up going into extra innings, and you don't have Rhys Hoskins, well, it's the cost of doing business.
Yeah.
But I think if we're a better defensive team, he could be a little bit less aggressive with his defensive replacements. I don't think he has that luxury because they're really, at almost every position, they're really kind of below average, and at some positions well below average. So I think, look, now he didn't have earlier in the season, he didn't have the personnel on his bench to be so aggressive with those moves. He does now. I mean, Roman Quinn is a legitimate defensive weapon in the outfield and can run the bases. So if he can get on base, he can make things happen offensively. That's a guy you can go to late in the game. Kingery is a better defensive shortstop than Asdrubal Cabrera. So, that's an option he didn't have earlier in the season before they had Cabrera. So, I think that I think that he has the personnel to make those moves now, and he has the kind of team where he almost has to make those moves.
Yeah, and then, you're going to get J.P. Crawford back, and, of the three shortstops, he might be the best defensively but weakest offensively, so that's another decision that he's going to have to throw into the mix, and he's really going to have five guys now to decide what to do in that infield situation, and you almost are at the point where Franco can't be taken out of the lineup.
Cabrera, too. I mean, you mentioned Crawford being you mentioned Crawford's offense. I think it's a coin flip between Kingery and Crawford at this point. Kingery's been one of the worst hitters in the league since the end of April. So I don't think you get a whole lot of offense from either of those guys, and you get enough, quite a bit more from Cabrera, to the point that I think he's going to have to play almost every day at shortstop, which means you're going to have to go to that bench late in games to get him out of there when you've got a lead and figure, all right, well, if it goes haywire on you and his spot comes up in the lineup again, you're just going to have to take it because I think it's that important to have his bat in the lineup.
Hey, are you surprised that Kingery has struggled so much? I mean, I know spring training is a totally different animal, but he seemed so advanced at spring training. Like you couldn't get anything by him. Are you surprised that he has struggled so mightily and has not really come around out of it? Like, okay, I would get it if you struggled out of the gates, they figured it out. But I thought that by now he may have – he seemed like one of those guys that was just a student of the game and would have pulled through. He just seems so overmatched, which is surprising to me. And I know that you got on the beat late this year from Boston, but are people surprised that he has struggled so much?
Yes, and yes. I thought he would struggle. I don't know if I've mentioned this on your show before, but I covered the Red Sox the last few years and 9 years, and when I think of Kingery and I think of what he did in spring training, it reminds me a lot of 2013, where Jackie Bradley Jr., who was not yet in AAA at that point, had an unbelievable spring, made the team out of nowhere. He was sort of the talk of spring training, and then the season starts and he was like 3 for 33 or 3 for 35, totally lost at the plate and got sent to AAA. I think of Xander Bogaerts, who in 2014 really, really struggled, almost the way Kingery has throughout the middle of the season, was one of the worst hitters in the American League. They stuck with him, didn't send him back to the minors, and the following year he was one of the better shortstops in the league. So, I'm not surprised Kingery struggled because he's a young player and because young players struggle, and all of that. I am a little surprised that he hasn't made quicker adjustments. And, again, some hitters do and some don't. I didn't see Bogaerts make any adjustments that year in 2014, and he came back in 2015 and had a very good year. So it's not to say Kingery is not going to be a good player, or it's not to say that, they overestimated how good the guy was, or did they rush him? Probably so. You'd have to look at what he's done this year and say that they rushed him, that he probably wasn't ready for this. But, again, there are reasons why you keep a young player in the big leagues when they're struggling, and you just don't often see it happen on a team that's contending. And that's what makes Kingery's struggles through the middle of the year stand out so much, is that they've been a first-place team for a month now, and they've been in contention all season long, and they've gotten really zero out of their shortstop. So, I'm surprised he struggled quite to the degree that he has, that he hasn't made the adjustments that he has. But there again, I've seen good hitters who just struggle to adjust, and then, they learn from it and they come back, and it takes them a little bit longer, and maybe that's the case with him.
Scott Lauber with us talking Phillies baseball. Scott, they've got sports betting now in Atlantic City, and before that series with the Diamondbacks, you had Jake Arrieta, you had Nick Pivetta, and Vinny Velasquez as the three starters. Would you have picked Pivetta as the only guy to come out of there with a win? I don't think you would have, but Pivetta, the latest starter to turn out the lights. You wrote about that.
That's why I don't bet on baseball. It's incredibly difficult. How often do you see, on paper, what looks like a pitcher's duel, and then they both get hit hard, and it happens all the time. So, yeah, no, it's incredibly would you have assumed that, that Eflin would be having the year that he's had? Would you assume that Pivetta had the start that he had and then would struggle for a while and come back? So, it's just impossible to. What's that old saying? You can't predict baseball, and it's impossible to look at and to say what's going to happen. It's sort of why. When talking about how the Padres are going to have two young pitchers make their debuts this weekend, you'd say, well, sure, the Phillies should smack those guys around and win a couple of games. But I've seen it go the other way so many times over the years, where guy comes up, makes his debut, and the team he's facing doesn't have a whole lot of video against him and doesn't have a whole lot of scouting reports that are accurate, and they struggle. So you never know. You never know what's going to happen. Sure, on paper it looks like the Phillies should do well this weekend, and we'll see what happens when the games start.
By the way, it's Mackenzie Mills who is heading to Miami in that deal, and with that, Jake Thompson,
no relation, has been
DFA'd for the Phillies. So, and the funny part is, Jake Thompson was kind of the key to that deal when they made that Hamels deal. If you remember, people were excited about him. He just has never been able to catch on. But the other pieces of that deal, Nick Williams, Alfaro, Eichhoff, who has not pitched all season, I guess. We'll see what ends up happening to him. But Jake Thompson was supposed to kind of be the key to that deal.
And you guys could probably say better than me why that hasn't happened, because I haven't really seen him much, earlier than this year. But yeah, no, he really hasn't sort of launched the way or taken off the way they expected. And designated for assignment means you've got 10 days to either trade him or pass him through waivers, and maybe he gets through waivers, and goes back to AAA and stays in the organization. And maybe they don't get, maybe there are enough teams that just haven't seen it from him that they don't that he doesn't get claimed. So We'll sort of see what what his future is and whether it's in the organization or not.
Now, since we're past the trade deadline, now obviously some things can still continue to happen throughout this month, but seeing the way Hamels has pitched in Chicago, the splits for him in Texas were pretty unbalanced in terms of pitching at home as on the road. Now, knowing what we now know, would you have preferred to see the Phillies go out and get a pitcher like Hamels? You know, you look at those games with the Braves that you referenced earlier. You got 7 with those Braves coming up late in the year. You have a Hamels on the mound in a game of that magnitude, or a Pivetta or an Eflin in one of those games, or a Velasquez, who's pitched well this year. But seeing the way he's pitched for Chicago, would you feel better now knowing what you know if they did make a move for a guy like Hamels?
Well, you know, it's interesting because I wrote something the day after the deadline about how they took a gamble by not adding a starting pitcher, not because their rotation needs the upgrade. I mean, their rotation's been as good, really, as almost any team in the National League. It's the fact that they have so many starters in that rotation who are going to hit their career high for innings in a season. That makes you say, well, hey, I mean, could they have used another piece? Could they have used some more depth? Maybe should they recognize the fact that they're going to have guys get into innings areas at the end of this month and early September that they've never been in before, and it wouldn't hurt to have another veteran starter. But Matt Klentak was pretty clear. He didn't want to get into that. He didn't want to get into that starters market, because when you're in the market for a starting pitcher at the deadline, you usually overpay. And he didn't want to do that. He also didn't want to stunt, I guess is the right word for it, the development of Eflin and Pivetta and Velasquez by taking any of them out of the rotation.
Yeah.
I mean, you still want those guys to pitch every 5th day. They've earned it. And you need to know going forward beyond this year if they are guys who fit in your rotation long term. The only way to find that out is to let them keep going out there. So I guess that's my long way of saying no. I think that they did the right thing by not adding a veteran starter. I think you're going to, in many ways, you're going to sink or swim for the rest of the year with a lot of the young guys you have, whether that's Velasquez and Pivetta and Eflin in your rotation, or Franco at third base, or Nick Williams in right field. I mean, they've gotten you this far. You need to figure out if they are pieces for your team long term. If they get you in the playoffs this year, hey, that's great. And maybe you find answers to that question. If they don't, well, you find answers to that question.
Well,
I think that they probably did the right thing by standing pat as far as the rotation.
And the good thing is, Scott, you know, Trevor Plouffe, Mitch Walding, Andrew Knapp should not be getting key at bats anymore. Justin Bour, Jorge Alfaro most likely will be bumped to the bench. Guys like Roman Quinn, they certainly have done their job in making this a deeper team for the most important 2 months of the season. And Scott, of course, covering the Phillies out in San Diego as they get ready to face the Padres, and he was kind enough to join us now on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Thanks so much, Scott. Always a pleasure, man.
You bet. Anytime, guys.